Hi, Kate here. This video is on Lyme disease and the fact that it's highly likely to have been developed as a weapon in bacteriological warfare, essentially by Nazi scientists working in the US. Now, this may sound pretty way out, but the data information backing this up is solidly mainstream. It's been well known about for decades, really. It's solidly mainstream. I will talk about some controversial things, but this connection of Lyme disease with bacteriological warfare is completely mainstream. It should be well known. It's not recognized. A lot of people don't know, and it's not given nearly the attention it deserves. I think it's one of the many crimes of U.S. imperialism, basically. So I'll explain. What is Lyme disease? It's a disease that people and other animals can get from ticks, from a tick bite. You can get it from a tick bite. Um, uh, Dogs get it, some other animals as well, mammals as well, I believe. Okay, with a person, if a person gets Lyme disease, it's a red splotch where the tick has bitten. Within like a 2 week period, this would expand. 2 week period, the splotch would expand, and the symptoms of Lyme disease vary, but includes often severe joint pain, partial facial paralysis, heart palpitations, depression, and with maybe 5% of the cases, cognitive and memory problems. Like there's some horror stories. I read one person who had Lyme disease kind of couldn't remember whether to stop or go at a red light when they were driving. Okay, so I wanted a few things about it. Okay, so the life cycle of the tick, what happens? Ticks are arachnids. They have 8 legs. Eight legs instead of six. They're related to spiders somewhat. They're kind of ugly looking critters. So they live on the ground. They're sort of ground dwelling. You can't get them from trees, but you can get it from walking in the woods. What they do, they go through a stage. They're like eggs or larvae are often spread by mice along trails on wooded areas, and then they wait. Tick would like wait for an animal, for a host animal to go by. Some ticks are actually sensitive to shadows or motion. They're really good at picking up on unavailable host, and they go through stages. They have to keep eating, get food, some kind of nutrient before they go on to the next stage. There are about 900 different tick species. Not all of them have Lyme disease, but a small number do. And there are other tick-borne diseases which are pretty bad too. One is Rocky Mountain spotted fever. I forget the other one, but and they are also fairly dangerous. Um, but Lyme disease is the big problem in the area. In the area I live, um, so um, now, when you're walking in the woods, these would DEET, like insect repellent, which is pretty effective in getting rid of ticks. I have two dogs, and no, about tick season. Tick season often spring and early summer. Like about a month ago, where I live, there was an insane tick problem. They were everywhere. A totally insane tick problem. I have two dogs, and my one dog has black fur, Max and Molly. Molly is sitting beside me here. No, let's see. This is Max. Molly's a little other end of the sofa. Okay, Molly has black fur, and Molly picks up ticks. It's insane. Like probably about a month ago, one day, like I was inspecting her for ticks. She had literally had 9 ticks on her head area. I was picking them out. Initially, I was kind of squeamish to pull them out, but I'm really good at it. It's kind of gratifying too. I find it. They're hard to find. They're under the fur. Really hard to find, but I kind of enjoy picking them out. If a tick gets engorged, like if you don't pick it out, it'll get bloated, big, ugly white blob. Okay, with people, whatever. Now, please don't take what I'm saying as medical advice. It's just information I've picked up, and possibly I could be wrong. So I just want to be responsible. Don't take anything I'm saying as medical advice, but the impressions I've gotten. Okay, a tick has to be on a person for at least 24 hours before you get Lyme disease or any of the other transmissible diseases ticks carry. Basically, a tick goes through a feeding cycle. It has a meal, like it drinks your blood, and it gets engorged. And then at the end of like a seed cycle meal, it'll like regurgitate or spit some of the stuff, some of the food stuff back into your bloodstream. That's when when you get the pathogens and all the horrible stuff that ticks carry. That's when you get it. So if a tick is on you for a short period of time, it's probably not harmful. I've had ticks on me more times than I like to remember. I have two dogs, and they do sleep in my bed sometimes, and I have had a tick a couple of times, tick crawling around me like 2 or 3 in the morning. It really weirded me out big times. I would take the tick and basically be able to find it and throw it in the toilet. Get a piece of tissue paper, put it in the toilet. I've had ticks on me. I pull them out. By the way, I know I've been really good at pulling them out. It's like peeling them off. It's weird. With a dog, I use the tweezers. I know people who like to remove ticks with a cigarette lighter or match. That's what I've read. That's the worst thing you could do. Basically, when a tick retracts its legs when you do that, and it spits its stuff, regurgitates its stuff back into you much earlier than it would have. So you'll pretty much get Lyme disease if you do that. So or high chance of doing it. It's the worst thing you could do. You'd better use your tweezers or whatever's available to pull it out that way, and wash your hands really well. The majority of ticks don't carry it. Majority of tick bites, you won't have Lyme disease. So the chances if you have a tick bite, you probably don't have it, but there is a chance that you do have it, and it's exploding as an epidemic where I live. Something like the CD or some estimates I've come across in the U.S. There are something like 300,000 cases a year, which is insane. One estimate put it at 400,000. It's insane. A lot of it's just not diagnosed. Many of the cases are not diagnosed or whatever. So where it's located, where ticks are located, sorry, Lyme disease is located in the U.S. Well, it's worldwide, but primarily in the U.S. In the northeast U.S. is a really big area for it, where I live. Northern parts of the northern Midwest, northern Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Canada, southeastern Canada, like area in Ontario, maybe Quebec, also in Maritimes. That's a big tick area. There's a region in Brazil where Lyme disease is prevalent, and there are cases in Northern Europe, something like 36,000 cases in Northern Europe every year. Um, every year. There have been cases in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, but they're thought maybe people got it from someplace else. So I'm not sure. So it is a worldwide thing, but primarily concentrated in Northeast U.S. It's spread by certain types of ticks. Like there are 900 species of ticks. The majority don't carry Lyme disease. There are like 3 or 4 do. What's called, I can't pronounce it, IOCDs ticks. And where I live, it's a deer tick, the most prevalent type, which carry Lyme disease. A deer tick, which is a small, ugly looking tick. I got really good at recognizing it. My dogs are packed with this often. Now, ticks, any type of ticks, is the way they're structured. They can carry a lot of bacteria. They can pack a wallop of bacteria. Okay, so Lyme disease is a problem. It's spreading. It can be very debilitating if you have it. I'm paranoid about it. I constantly do tick checks. I've said I've had ticks on me, but I peel them off. I wouldn't be surprised if I actually have low level Lyme disease myself. It works that way. I haven't noticed any symptoms, but each summer I'm like, cross my fingers, I'll get through the summer without getting Lyme disease. Okay, so a whole bunch of things about Lyme disease are really odd. So first of all, it was first appeared in 1975 in the town of Lyme, Connecticut. Lyme, Connecticut is a small town, like a New England looking town. It seems to be largely middle class, New England village type place. There's Old Lyme, which is kind of nearby, which is like the historic area. There's a New England seaport, I think a whaling port, I'm not sure, back in the day, Old Lyme. It's not far from New London, Connecticut, which is a medium-sized industrial city, which is a lot different. I think Lyme is kind of more or less a suburb of New London, and it first appeared there, and it seemed to have taken researchers in the medical sector quite a while to figure it out and identify it, but there was a lot of research done in the 1980s. It was identified. The bacteria, if I didn't mention the bacteria, which carries Lyme disease, is called Latin name Borrelia bacterium, but Borrelia burgdorferi. named after the guy who identified it, a Swiss biologist who came to the U.S. named Willy Bergdorfer. Willy Bergdorfer, and he plays a role in later on in the story. This type of bacteria is called a spirochete, which means it's a weird spiral shape and has a flagella like a tail, which can be good for burrowing into muscle tissue and internal organs and fun things like that. Okay, so where was I? Okay, so some odd things about it. It took the medical profession a long time to recognize it. There was research done in the 80s and 90s. Oddly, it was made a reportable disease in 1997, like 22 years after it was first appeared, which strikes me as a bit odd. Although I don't have a medical background, I don't know if that's unusual or not. And the big thing about Lyme disease, for a long time, doctors have been very reluctant to diagnose someone with Lyme disease. Like back, there was a huge stigma attached to it back in the day. You read horror stories. People who had to go through a nightmare, see like 10 doctors or more to find somebody who'd believe them and sympathetic and would be able to give them a course of treatment. People did go through a nightmare. The leftist transgender activist Leslie Feinberg had Lyme disease. She was an editor, writer, and wrote Stone Butch Blues and Transgender Warriors, both kind of famous in the trans community. She was one of the leaders of the Workers' World Party. She was one of the editors of the newspaper called Workers' World. She had an interesting column in Workers' World about LGBT issues from a Marxist perspective. Is really interesting. She also had a column on Lyme disease, the Lyme Diaries. And I know back in the 80s or whenever, she had a hell of a time struggled to find a sympathetic doctor who would treat her. And transphobia was also part of that. So she became a Lyme activist and building Lyme awareness. She had a column called the Lyme Diaries in the Workers' World paper. I haven't been able to find it. I think the Workers' World is a socialist organization. They're in the process of compiling. She died in 2014 of complications, not from Lyme disease, I guess, but from basically complications from tick-borne diseases. So this stuff can be really dangerous. And Leslie Feinberg wrote how I've read stuff how she went through a lot of difficulty with this. So I think now doctors are somewhat more sympathetic and more liable to treat. And the treatment consists of course, of antibiotics, and which, if it's caught early, can almost completely eliminated, from what I understand, if it's caught early enough. There are a number of people, who claim to have chronic Lyme disease, and this is really controversial. Chronic Lyme disease is often resistant to antibiotics. It's very difficult to get rid of, and this idea is not accepted by the medical establishment. Like mainstream medical establishment does not recognize it. It's kind of regarded as medical fraud. The Wikipedia page basically calls it pseudoscience. However, there are groups, there are advocacy groups, activism groups, there are websites and support groups for people who claim to have chronic Lyme disease. It's not recognized by the medical establishment. Interestingly, there's a documentary film made about chronic Lyme disease. It's called Under Our Skin, The Untold Story of Lyme Disease, came out in 2008. The director was Andy Abrahams Wilson. His sister claims to have a chronic Lyme disease. And when this documentary film came out, it was something of a bombshell, like the New York Times called it inflammatory. It had to huge bomb. There was a huge debate over this film. Basically, there was pushback against this. He claimed, like the main organization regulating or like identifying what are considered diseases and what are not in the U.S. is called the IDSA, the International Disease Society. I believe it's the International Disease Society of America. There's another one. There are a couple others. In this film, Andy Abrahams Wilson claimed they had a conflict of interest over this. There actually was a lawsuit. There was a lawsuit. A Connecticut Congressman, Richard Bloom, I believe it was a state representative, Richard Blumenthal, joined with Andy Abrams Wilson, a couple other people, and including the Connecticut Attorney General, so this is mainstream, Connecticut Attorney General filed a class action lawsuit against the IDSA, saying to force them to include chronic Lyme disease as a recognized disease so people could be treated. They lost the lawsuit. It was thrown out, and the mainstream opinion is it's pseudoscience and there's nothing to it. And often, chronic Lyme disease is regarded as misdiagnosed fibromyalgia, like original Lyme disease was back in the day. So there's been a struggle for acceptance. I don't know that much about it to take a side on this. There are some really interesting things. Glenn Greenwald talked about the under Trump, liberals developed the cult of the expert. Like, you're not supposed to criticize experts or consensus opinion. You're not. That's any criticism is you're considered a Trump supporter, right winger, QAnon nut. Any criticism is not encouraged. Is not allowed. There are some examples. Getting off the subject somewhat, there are some examples here. In 2020 was a film that came out called Planet of the Humans. It was produced by or directed by Jeff Gibbs, who's a longtime environmental filmmaker, and produced by Michael Moore. They've been longtime collaborators. So this movie, Planet of the Humans, was really controversial in the environmental movement. A fire shitstorm over it. Basically, what the film said a bunch of things, but basically what I got out of it is that for renewable sources of energy like wind, solar power, biofuels, things like that, don't work. I mean, they work, but they're not. They can't produce the amount of energy we need for an industrial society. I mean, for industrial technological civilization. We desperately have to get beyond using fossil fuels. So climate change is very real. But on the other hand, we don't have the technology to develop an alternative. And either way, we're kind of screwed. The film mentioned, there's a clip on the film of a fair, environmental fair, like speeches and concerts, and some of the leading figures of the environmental movement was there. Bill McGibbon was there, who made a huge contribution, but he's become kind of a shit live now. But Bill McGibbon and some other luminaries in the environmental movement was there. And in this, at the entrance to this fair, was a large solar panel. And people assumed the solar panel was powering this. It turned out that the solar panel big, huge solar panel, I don't remember the dimensions, but it was lucky the solar panel could power a toaster. And so the real energy, the electricity for this fair was actually at concerts and stuff, was actually generated, came from a generator, gas-powered generator, old-fashioned gas-powered generator. So some critics of the film pushed back, said, yes, that clip was from 10 years ago, and now solar power is more efficient. Solar is much more energy efficient than it was back then, which is true. But I think still it's not a huge improvement. It's not a huge improvement. So overall, it doesn't seem like there are big drawbacks, environmental drawbacks. The solar panels, they're very expensive. They don't last long. They need to be replaced fairly often. And to manufacture them is extremely environmentally destructive. And the film spent time on this. Biomass, which is a joke. It's not even really. It's basically wood chips, liquefied or gasified wood chips made into methane or something. It's not work. I mean, it works, but it's environmentally extremely destructive. It's not a renewable fuel. Wind power, the problems with that, basically for a wind turbine, you need to essentially clear cut a mountaintop, which is environmentally destructive and then damages birds, things like that. So either way, we're kind of screwed. And so the film gave it like a Malthusian bent, and I would disagree with this earlier video. I talked about Malthusianism. I would disagree with there are things, but we do need to really, especially the left needs to think of how we do have a mind. We need to get out of this situation. Nuclear may be what we need. Maybe thorium powered nuclear power, nuclear plants are maybe a little safer. I hope to do a video about this in the near future. But anyway, we need to have a debate on it. So the first reaction from the environmental community was to shut down any debate. There's a guy named Josh Fox, who was also an environmental filmmaker. He made a Gaslands, a classic film about fracking, a classic film. He led a campaign to get This film, Planet of the Humans documentary, was made freely available on YouTube and other platforms. He led his campaign to get it banned, to get it off YouTube and to get censored and totally banned. And he succeeded. A big uproar. He actually succeeded for a time. There were allegations of copyright infringement, something UK copyright infringement, and with this film, it's taken off YouTube. It was put back on. I don't know. I think they modified the film slightly. It was put back on. So anyway, that's one example. Another example is, this is really controversial, but ivermectin. Now, ivermectin was invented or developed in the 1970s by a Japanese researcher who won a Nobel Prize for it. Ivermectin is very, very effective anti-parasitic medication. It's primarily used in the U.S. as people call it horse paste, horse parasites. It's extremely effective. It's been used in Africa to basically stop river blindness. Some river areas in the Congo and areas in Africa, it was just understood by the time you're 40, you're blind. That was just the way it went. And this really, in the 70s and 80s, it really changed people's lives. So the guy deserved a Nobel Prize for its invention. Okay, so there are people today who claim, sizable number of people who claim to say it's very effective against COVID-19. And, I'm not a scientist, but I've seen, seems to me very credible. India, which had a catastrophe, a catastrophic situation, probably a fault of the government. Modi was a catastrophe, like the U.S. was under Trump. They're using in some areas, and what I can tell is very effective in alleviating it. This doesn't get a lot of publicity. Interestingly, states, they have a more decentralized medical system, in states like Kerala don't allow ivermectin. It's COVID-19 is still rampaging out of control. So, and it's being used in Mexico and elsewhere. So also there's a retired British doctor named Dr. John Campbell, who has a very popular YouTube channel where he talks about COVID-19. This guy's solidly mainstream. He, like 2 or 3 times a week, he gives talks on it. He has a really big following. He's very meticulous, and he's very conservative, like scientifically very conservative. He's the last guy to jump out on a limb, and he has a wide following. He's talking about ivermectin, shows you it is pretty promising. And okay, so one of the proponents of it is a guy named Dr. Pierre Corey, and a biologist who became a podcaster, Brett Weinstein. They were on the Joe Rogan show a few days ago, and this wasn't allowed on YouTube. It was yanked from YouTube. This was our Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan obviously doesn't have a background in this stuff, but these guys did, and he cross-referenced them like a defense lawyer. And they seem like they knew what they're talking about. They seem, to me, very convincing. They talk about like regulatory capture. It's not accepted. To be blunt, a lot of the regulatory agencies or the medical establishment is very much in bed with the pharmaceutical industry, which is corrupt. Pfizer had massive corruption scandal a few years ago. It is corrupt. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. People depend on it. It's the level of regulatory capture in all layers of the U.S. government is insane. This doesn't mean I buy into stuff like pandemic or there are crazy conspiracy theories. Yes, that doesn't mean I buy into everything, but I think people should be able to freely talk about it. Similarly, if these guys were on Joe Rogan, I saw about a quarter of it. It sounded very convincing. I'm just not into all the technical details, but I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert, but it seemed convincing to me. So anyway, I Googled it the next day, and there was a wave of criticism like, Joe Rogan promotes a discredited ivermectin conspiracy theory. Have gone on like without giving any real background. It's just a discredited conspiracy theory. Even though the World Health Organization kind of says it's okay, many national governments now, the national government India says it's okay, Mexico says it's okay, many places say it's totally okay. I told a family member about ivermectin, and they were kind of skeptical about it. So the next day, my family member called me and sent me an urgent email. She really wanted me to see this email. So I looked at the email, and the email was like a message, had like an attachment to it, basically an article that the FDA recommends not using ivermectin. It's not safe. Like that's supposed to settle the issue. I mean, I don't trust the FDA. There's enormous amount of regulatory capture. There's massive conflict of interest. So I know I'm going to be labeled a conspiracy theorist. By the way, just the vaccines. I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any means. I do feel the vaccines were massively rushed. Operation Warp Speed. And yes, I do have an acquaintance in the neighboring state, New Hampshire, an anarchist, active in the anarchist community. This person had went into cardiac congestion from the Moderna vaccine. I'm not making this up. I went to cardiac congestion from the Moderna vaccine, and pretty grim prognosis. Looks like person will need a heart, is waiting for a heart transplant. This person is only like in her mid 20s, I believe, mid to late 20s. And yes, every vaccine does have a certain percentage, uh, all vaccines have a certain percentage which turn out really bad. Yes, that kind of is par for the course, and generally it's regarded as acceptable risk. In vaccinating, keeping the overall population safe, it's kind of acceptable. And yes, I get that, but some of the stories I'm hearing, I haven't done research of it, are pretty little over the top. Like somebody I personally know is going to need a heart transplant because of the Moderna vaccine. It's kind of insane. So, that's all I'll say about it. I don't really know. I'm getting off the subject a bit here, back to Lyme disease. What I'm saying is these people claim to have chronic Lyme disease. They might be right. I'm not going to dismiss it out of hand. Okay, so yeah, as I said, chronic Lyme disease is regarded by the mainstream as a fraud. They don't believe it exists, but there is something. Called PTLDS, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, where after a course of antibiotics or whatever, some of the symptoms persist. This is recognized by the medical establishment, and I don't exactly know the difference between chronic Lyme disease, which is regarded as a fraud, as pseudoscience, and PTLDS. I actually don't know the difference between it. I think it's a degree of severity, right? A degree of severity. Like apparently 5% of people with Lyme disease get PTLDS, and that is accepted by the mainstream. Okay, so another really interesting thing about Lyme disease, there are vaccines for it, but they're not available. This is kind of complicated. Back in the 90s, medical researcher at Tufts in the Boston area, Tufts Medical School, developed working for GlaxoSmithKline, famous pharmaceutical company. He developed a vaccine for Lyme disease. It passed the clinical trials. It had a 70% effectiveness rate. And it was marketed from like roughly 1997 to the early 2000s. I forget the date. Well, again, this is controversial. There was a huge amount of bad publicity, and I'm not entirely sure why. Sources that I've read say it's largely sensationalist and they didn't have a basis in fact, but there are allegations that it was unsafe, that people developed Lyme disease or developed arthritis, or I don't know. I don't know enough to evaluate. So there were organizations which protested this vaccine. I don't know if they were the older Lyme disease advocacy groups or if they were newer groups which had formed in response to this vaccine, or probably both. But there was apparently a lawsuit. They had a class action lawsuit against GlaxoSmithKline, and the lawsuit was thrown out. The courts threw it out. The CDC ruled that it's safe, and the lawsuit was thrown out. But the company withdrew it. Decided it wasn't profitable and threw it. So interestingly, a couple of years later, another company bought it out and then rebranded it and marketed it for dogs, like Lyme vaccine for dogs. And my vet has been after me. It's expensive. My vet has been after me to get my dogs vaccinated with it. So I don't know. It's not available for humans, but it's available for dogs. Interesting story. Same thing about antibiotics. A couple of years ago, I had some really big dental problems. I was seeing a dentist, like emergency basis, and he said, I had an abscess in a tooth, which had it was very painful, a lot of bacteria built up in it. And he said, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to prescribe antibiotics, but there's something you could do. You could buy fish antibiotics. Human antibiotics, it's very difficult to get a prescription for legally, but you can just walk into a pet food store and buy fish antibiotics. Seriously, they're like for tropical fish, for your fish are green under the gills or something. You get fish antibiotics, and you just buy it over the counter. You just buy it, and it's drops, put a few drops in. And I don't remember what I did. I think it was drops. Anyway, I thought I was going to have to make up a story of a tropical fish. I don't have an aquarium. I did as a little kid. But hey, I have a tropical fish aquarium. My Siamese fighting fish are a little green under the gills, no pun intended. And but I didn't have to make up a story at all. So I just walked in and bought it. So anyway, so you can't get a prescription for it, but you can buy it at a pet food store. Really, that's how screwed up the U.S. healthcare system is. So as far as this issue with the Lyme vaccine, I really don't know who's right, who's wrong. I don't. I'm this time I'm inclined to side with the mainstream. It probably is safe, but I don't know. And interestingly, there have been in the 2000s, like even the last couple of years, one thing I read said Pfizer is developing a Lyme vaccine, a Lyme disease vaccine, and it passed like phase 2 or whatever. But apparently they may have dropped it, and several other companies were also doing this, but they may have dropped it. I'm not sure. My guess there isn't a vaccine available, and there probably won't be one for a long time because complicated reasons, but it's basically just not cost effective, and ultimately blame capitalism, even though it is really a debilitating disease. So it's kind of complicated. So there's just some really odd things going on about Lyme disease. Okay, so the main point of the video I want to make actually is its connection to biological warfare. Okay, so background here. I partly grew up on Eastern Long Island. Eastern Long Island is like an island or a peninsula shaped place that juts out from New York City. And it's south of Connecticut. You get the Long Island Sound. And most people think of Long Island as very suburban, and it pretty much is. But you have like Eastern Long Island, like first you get Queens and New York City, it's one of the 5 boroughs of New York. You get Nassau County, and then you get Suffolk County, and Eastern Suffolk County is very rural. There are a lot of potato farms, one of the major industries there. And okay, so there's a North Fork and a South Fork, two like peninsulas which jut out. And there's Peconic Bay inside there, and then there's Shelter Island. Okay, so the South Fork is really, really beautiful to drive through. Great beaches facing the Atlantic and dunes, big dunes. Montauk, the lighthouse. The South Fork is also known to be where rich people live. The Hamptons. There's like Southampton, East Hampton, Hampton Bay, as far as I know. Hampton Bay. So driving through this kind of you see these big like estates, like ultra modern buildings, ultra modern houses on the dunes. It's kind of beautiful, but you can say super wealthy people live there. The movers and shakers in Wall Street and whatever. Okay, so the North Fork. Oh yeah, there's also a Native American reservation. There's like the Shinnecock people. Shinnecock Nation. Roger Waters from Pink Floyd, who's an activist, is also involved in activism, helping the Shinnecock people with land claims and things like that, water control, water resources. Okay, so the North Fork of Long Island is a little different. It's largely blue collar, a lot of potato farms, a lot of Polish people. The biggest ethnic group of Polish people. I think next to Chicago, it's the largest concentration of Polish Americans in the U.S. There used to be this town Riverhead, which is right between the two forks. There used to be a Polish language radio station, played a lot of cool polkas. I don't know if they're still around. I doubt it. I partly grew up in there in high school. Spent like 2 years there. Okay. So there's then you get end of it is what they call Southold. It's a township, and there are towns in Southold. There's East Marion, which is a Greek community, which great souvlaki, like Greek food. Used to be a really great restaurant. I doubt they're still there, but then at the very end is something called Orient. There's Orient and Orient Point. Orient, I live there. It's a really small. Looks like a New England fishing village. It's really kind of cool, really laid back. It's on the water. It's really, really cool. A lot of history in the Revolutionary War. And at the end is Orient Point, which is not really a town. There's some houses. There's like a housing development and a lot of now. Okay, so about 1.5 miles from Orient Point. Oh yeah, by the way, Orient Point, you can take a ferry to New London, Connecticut. I think it's like, I don't remember, 2 hours. I don't remember how long it takes. 2.5 hours. There's a car ferry, and I've done this many times. The transition is really abrupt. Like Orient Point, some really small, rural, laid back down. New London, not far away, is like industrial, bigger. It's a major difference. So if you want to avoid long distance driving on Long Island, you want to avoid going through New York City, you go around, take a loop. Anyway. So, okay, about 1.5 miles from Orient Point is a place called Plum Island. It's long known to be a U.S. government research center. Some people I went to high school with, their parents worked at Plum Island. I have no idea what they did, but there are people who live in Orient Point who commute. People, as far as I know, don't live on Plum Island. It's closed off. It's been closed off to the public. Okay, so some interesting things about Plum Island. About, I think also maybe a mile and a half or not too far from Lyme, Connecticut. So there were rumors. It's supposedly the U.S. government said through years that they do research into farm animal diseases. That was the official line. But there have been rumors going on for years that there was a little more going on than that. They were doing bacteriological warfare. There were periodic rumors. There was people didn't like to talk about it. It was kind of understood, but there was a little nervousness. And this is a very conservative area, by the way, Republicans. That's a largely Republican area. Growing up, I hated the place. I mean, I was bored out of my mind. I was a lot of teenagers, like 14, 15-year-olds. I was bored out of my mind. Now I can appreciate that area. It's really beautiful and laid back. I was bored out of my mind there. Like Connecticut had all the cool radio stations, and Long Island you had these either country music or Polish polka music or old people's music. Connecticut is really cool rock stations or hip hop stations. They played the cool stuff. Anyway, so I was in Orient Point. So the Block Island is like Plum Island was a little ways off, and you couldn't go there, but people would know about it, and there was some nervousness. Okay, so in 1993, a newspaper called Newsday. It's a Long Island newspaper, and it was actually fairly good. I don't know what they're like now, but they actually were a little out of the mainstream. They did some edgy reporting. They did some fairly good investigative reporting. In 1993, Newsday had a bombshell article. It was by an investigative reporter named John McDonald. It was called, the article was entitled Lyme Disease and Biowarfare. It came out in November 21st of 1993. Now, there are two counterpunch articles which references this, which talk about Lyme disease. I talked about counterpunch last time. They do have their uses. They're not totally horrible. The two articles by Carl Grossman, who's a leftist of some sort, and he's a Lyme disease researcher. I don't know what he does. I think he's like a journalist. I'm not sure he's a Lyme researcher. Anyway, he discusses this argument. This article came out in 1993. He says, in a November 21st, 1993 article in Newsday, John McDonald documented the biological warfare mission of Plum Island with records he obtained. The piece began in a 1950s military plan to cripple the Soviet economy by killing horses, cattle, and swine, called for making biological warfare weapons out of exotic animal diseases out of Plum Island Laboratory. Now declassified Army records reveal. And a copy of one of the records from 1951 was the front page of that issue of Newsday, and that was a bombshell. So basically, he was saying that, in the 1950s onward, it was used for bacteriological warfare experiments, and not too far from a highly populated area. So the article goes on, says John McDonald said in this Newsday article, said documents and interviews disclosed for the first time what officials have denied for years, that the mysterious and closely guarded animal lab off the east end of Long Island was originally designed to conduct top secret research into replicating dangerous viruses that could be used to destroy enemy livestock. And I don't know if he mentioned Lyme, but that was kind of strongly implied if he didn't mention it, or strongly implied. Backtracking a bit, Carl Grossman, in his two articles, mentions a little earlier book from 1982. It was The Belarus Secret: The Nazi Connection in America, written by John Loftus. And John Loftus was a very respected mainstream guy. He was a lawyer who specialized in hunting Nazis and pursuing Nazis for the Office of Special Investigations of the U.S. Department of Justice. And what he says, I'm quoting, Nazi germ warfare scientists brought to the U.S. after World War II, who experimented with poison ticks dropped from planes to spread rare diseases. I have received some information suggesting that the U.S. tested some of these poison ticks on the Plum Island artillery range during the early 1950s. Most of the germ warfare records have been shredded, but there's a top secret U.S. document confirming that clandestine attacks on crops and animals took place at this time. That came out in 1983. That's pretty damning. And the article goes on to say that Loftus points to the hypothesis that the poison ticks are the source from Plum Island research. Poison ticks are the source of the Lyme disease spirochete. And yet, sooner or later, the whole truth will come out, but probably not in my lifetime. So there was by the early 90s or mid 90s, there was developing a lot of environmental activism on eastern Long Island and Connecticut. There was some opposition brewing, and people were getting really worried about what was going on here. Environmental groups were lobbying for some kind of disclosure. So here we go. In 1995, with Lyme disease epidemic on Long Island, like it was huge on eastern Long Island at that time, in most areas of the U.S., a congressman. There was the Congressman Michael Forbes, who's a newly elected congressman from Long Island. He joined with actually Carl Grossman, the author of this article, and with John McDonald, the author of the earlier Newsweek piece. And what they did is they went to Plum Island, and it's closed to the public, but he just rented a boat or got a boat, got a bunch of people, just landed there. Evaded the Coast Guard, just landed there, landed on Plum Island, which is kind of gutsy right there. And he and his group, this congressman and a couple other people, just finally confronted the director of Plum Island. He could get away with it because he's a congressman, but he confronted the director, the Plum, and so he demanded information about tick weaponization there and a link to Lyme disease as related to Loftus, the author's earlier book. He took John McDonald, an investigative reporter at the Long Island newspaper Newsday. Okay, so when Representative Forbes, on his quote raid on Fire Island, confronted the center's director, it was a Dr. Harley Moon, in the presence of McDonald and me, Carl Grossman. When this group confronted the director of Harley Moon, he basically said, I can neither confirm nor deny, usual government bullshit. I can neither confirm nor deny. So he didn't get any information, but there was a lot of really bad publicity. Next book came out about this bombshell book, came out in 2004. It was by an attorney, a lawyer, Michael Carroll, who grew up on Eastern Long Island, and he and his wife were both lawyers when I moved to California. Wrote a book. The book is called Lab 257, The Disturbing Story of the Government's Secret Plum Island Germ Laboratory. And Carl Grossman has a whole article in Counterpunch devoted to this, a review of it and some other things going on. And this book, I haven't read it, but I've read reviews of and synopsises of the book. What Michael Carroll does in this book is first goes through some of the history of it. So anyway, this book talks about a Nazi scientist, Eric Traub, and he came to the U.S. in the 1930s, studied at the Rockefeller Institute in Princeton, so he studied virology, interestingly. And when I say he was a Nazi scientist, he was literally a Nazi, not just someone working for them. He was an enthusiastic Nazi. He was a member of the Deutsche Amerikaner Volksbund, German-American Nazi group at the time. He was an enthusiastic Nazi. There was a Yaphank. Interestingly, Yaphank, Long Island, had a Nazi community. There was a camp there, training camp for kids, Nazi kids. And also at one point, the streets of Yaphank were named after Nazi leaders. That was years ago. And, they don't want you to remember this now, but close cooperation. So I think it was 1939 or right before the Second World War broke out. Eric Traub went back to Germany, and he was the head of the Nazi bacteriological warfare project. He reported directly to Heinrich Himmler. He's a pretty high-ranking guy. And anyway, at the end of the war, he was in the Soviet zone, the Russian occupation zone. And according to Wikipedia, says the U.S. rescued Eric Traub. They got him from the Russians, which possibly meant the Russians were going to shoot him, which might have been the best outcome. Or, I don't know, maybe Houston themselves, I don't really know. But the Americans got him, brought him to Denver, and Michael Carroll kind of describes some of the stuff going on with Eric Traub and some other Nazi scientists, a group around him. They brought Eric Traub to Denver, first of all, and he worked in bacteriological warfare there. Then Eric Traub was a leading figure pushing for this research on Plum Island. Apparently, the Plum Island research facility, bacteriological research facility, was a subsidiary of Fort Detrick, which is a really famous bacteriological warfare research center. It's really famous. This was a spin-off, an offshoot of Fort Detrick. So, and then he goes on to say, there are strong, and he goes on to say, there are stories, there's no Nazi doctors, and there was a line of research which they used ticks and other insects to try to deliberately spread diseases. It was originally the Nazis experimented on this in the Second World War to use against the Russians primarily, but then so did the U.S. a bit later on. I'm going to read some of this from Carl Grossman's article on Michael Carroll here. Okay, so this Eric Traub was head of what's called Incel Reims, this Reims Island, Nazi Bacteriological Research Project Institute. So Carl Grossman says, Lab 257 also maintains that there's a link between the Plum Island Center and the emergence of Lyme disease. It, quote, suddenly surfaced 10 miles from Plum Island in Old Lyme, Connecticut in 1975. Carroll cites years of experimentation with ticks on Plum Island and the possibility of an accidental or purposeful release. He says the tick is the perfect germ vector, which is why it has long been fancied as a germ weapon by the early bio-warriors from Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan to the Soviet Union and the United States. It goes on to say a source who worked on Plum Island in the 1950s recalls that animal handlers and a scientist released ticks outdoors on the island. They called him the Nazi scientist. When they came in 1951, they were inoculating these ticks. And Lab 257 goes on, according to the review, Dr. Traub's World War II handiwork consisted of serial virus sprays developed on Incel Reims Island, and tested over occupied Russia, and of field work for Heinrich Himmler in Turkey. In Indeed, his colleagues conducted bug trials by dropping live beetles from planes. An outdoor tick trial would have been de rigueur for Eric Traub. So it makes it highly likely he was doing this stuff. And anyway, a bit later, there was a Newsweek, not Newsday, but Newsweek magazine article in 2019 entitled "The Pentagon May Have Released Weaponized Ticks That Help the Spread of Lyme Disease. An Investigation Ordered." It was the headline of Newsweek, and that was a bombshell. Okay, finally, in 2019, there was a book that came out called Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Bacteriological Warfare by Chris Newby. Now, Chris Newby is interesting. She's a respected science writer. Now, she's not a quack. She says the blurb in back of her book says Chris Newby is an award-winning science writer at Stanford University and the senior producer of the Lyme disease documentary Under Our Skin. So yeah, that's the documentary I mentioned that alleged that chronic Lyme disease was a thing, and Chris Newby was a part of this, and she's a very well respected person. As previously, Newby was a technology writer for Apple and other Silicon Valley companies. She lives in Palo Alto. So Chris Newby got Lyme disease. While vacationing on Martha's Vineyard, Chris Newby was bitten by an unseen tick. That one bite changed her life forever, pulling her into the abyss of a devastating illness that took 10 doctors to diagnose. She had the same problem as Leslie Feinberg. 10 doctors to diagnose and years to recover from. Newby had joined the ranks of the 400,000 Americans who are afflicted with Lyme disease each year. As a science writer, Chris Newby was driven to understand this disease, why this disease is so misunderstood and its patients so mistreated. This quest led to Willy Bergdorfer. As I said, he was a Swiss biologist who came to the U.S. who identified it. And anyway, he did Now, according to her, Chris Bergdorfer actually said in a recorded conversation that, yeah, it was the result of he made several, he identified it and he did some amazing work. The NIH has an obituary arm, says he was a great guy. He had infectious humor, which is probably infectious is a bad term to use here, but what a great guy he was. He really did some amazing research, but he actually kind of may have been part of this as well. Apparently, according to Chris Newby, he in effect admitted that it was a result of a bacteriological warfare experiment gone haywire. And other sources say that there are files which he had, which actually specifically say it was Lyme disease was spread, was deliberately created. Or now this was back in the day, like 50s, going to the 50s or 70s. At least in the 1970s, genetic engineering was not known about, or it was just in its infancy. There were some experiments at MIT tweaking E. coli bacteria. Now, of course, we have CRISPR and things like that, gene editing software. That's gone light years ahead. But there's still a lot they could do back then. Basically, as far as I understand, the experimentation was with getting ticks to carry these diseases. Ticks are known as vectors. A tick can pack a wallop of bacteria, and I assume they found the E. coli, they found this bacteria. After a lot of experimentation, found one that it could carry, and then spread. Now, maybe they spread it either on purpose or accidentally. Could have easily been spread accidentally. Plum Island is a site for changed her life forever, pulling her into the abyss of a devastating illness that took 10 doctors to diagnose. She had the same problem as Leslie Feinberg. 10 doctors to diagnose and years to recover from. Newby had joined the ranks of the 400,000 Americans who are afflicted with Lyme disease each year. As a science writer, Chris Newby was driven to understand this disease, why this disease is so misunderstood, and its patients so mistreated. This quest led to Willy Bergdorfer. As I said, he was a Swiss biologist who came to the U.S. who identified it. And anyway, he did. Now, according to her, Chris Bergdorfer actually said in a recorded conversation that, yeah, it was the result of he made several, he identified it and he did some amazing work. The NIH has an obituary arm, says he was a great guy. He had infectious humor, which is probably infectious is a bad term to use here, but what a great guy he was. He really did some amazing research, but he actually kind of may have been part of this as well. Apparently, according to Chris Newby, he in effect admitted that it was a result of a bacteriological warfare experiment gone haywire. And other sources say that there are files which he had, which actually specifically say it was Lyme disease was spread, was deliberately created. Or now this was back in the day, like 50s, going to the 50s or 70s. At least in the 1970s, genetic engineering was not known about, or it was just in its infancy. There were some experiments at MIT tweaking E. coli bacteria. Now, of course, we have CRISPR and things like that, gene editing software. That's gone light years ahead. But there's still a lot they could do back then. Basically, as far as I understand, the experimentation was with getting ticks to carry these diseases. Ticks are known as vectors. A tick can pack a wallop of bacteria, and I assume they found the E. coli, they found this bacteria. After a lot of experimentation, found one that it could carry, and then spread. Now, maybe they spread it either on purpose or accidentally. Could have easily been spread accidentally. Plum Island is a site for a lot of migratory wildlife. Birds have migration with seagulls and lots of other birds stop there. Fish. I mean, it could have spread really easily. And Carol, and Michael Carroll, he goes on to say later on, this Carl Grossman, counterpunch writer, in an interview in talking with Michael Carroll, says, he came back to Eastern Long Island. By 2003, the government decided to close down this facility. They kind of probably moved it to Manhattan, Kansas, which is ostensibly not wildlife, sorry, farm animal disease research, but we know it's bacteriological warfare. And Manhattan, Kansas, not Manhattan, New York City. Manhattan, Kansas is kind of a rural area, not highly populated, not in like Eastern Long Island, Connecticut. And my hunch, probably the rich people of the Hamptons may have had something to do with it. The idea of closing it down in 2003, which basically was liable to an Arab, liable to an like Al Qaeda terrorist attack. So they had to close it down, move it, and it was off limits to the public. It was closed off for quite a while. We don't know what happened, but kind of 2003, 2004, or 2005 or so, the government actually wanted to make this into a housing development. And Carol and their environmental groups, as well as Carol and Michael Carroll and other people, really, it's a horrible idea. Michael Carroll says this island, Plum Island, is utterly contaminated. They haven't been able to get rid of it. It's utterly contaminated. The laboratory itself, the building on the outside, and just utterly impossible. The only thing we can do at this point is make it into a nature preserve, close it off, and make it into a nature preserve. It's still going to spread. As seagulls or birds, it's impossible to stop it from spreading. That's known in little Long Island, Eastern Long Island, has had a really big Lyme disease problem. So some of the stuff going. So finally, it actually was very recently made into a nature reserve. Trump, of all people, made it. Yeah, so I signed on to it, and it was made into a nature reserve. And it's closed off, which is the only thing they can do. So I think overall, this. Oh, by the way, by the way, Michael Carroll's book, when it came out, got a really good blurb from Mario Cuomo, who had been the former governor of New York. So this is pretty mainstream, not conspiracy theories, and very mainstream. So anyway, we can point to the crimes of U.S. imperialism and bacteriological warfare just should not be done. It's a horrible thing, and should not be done. There's stuff coming out now about COVID may have come from a lab. And this is another really highly controversial. It used to be considered a crazy conspiracy theory. You weren't allowed to talk about it. Now, with the narrative shifted, you can talk about it, although some people don't like it. Saying it came from a lab, like gain of function research gain of function research was not allowed to ban in the US, but you could do it in China. So American and other companies essentially outsourced it to a Chinese lab where it was allowed. And this is not bashing the Chinese. Some of the people propounding this, the idea came from Malay themselves, are racist, and this anti-Chinese racism or anti-communism. And this is not the position I'm taking. Like some hardcore Marxist Leninists who like China said, you're being anti-Chinese, you defend the Chinese state. Well, yeah, maybe, but I'm not bashing China or an evil plot from the Chinese communists. What I'm basically saying is, it's ultimately American capitalism. The regulations are kind of more lax and possibly came out of a lab. And I think it's kind of likely migratory wildlife birds have migration with seagulls and lots of other birds stop there. Fish. It could have spread really easily. And the comedian Jon Stewart made some waves where he recently said, yeah, he came out and he's a comedian, sort of vaguely political comedian. I'm not a big fan. He's a liberal. I'm not a big fan of him, but he actually said, he thinks it came from a lab, and he joked about it, saying, it like the Wuhan lab is literally named the Wuhan COVID research lab. Chances are it probably the way, forget how he put it, but the chances are likely they came from a lab. So anyway, it's the crimes of U.S. imperialism, and this kind of stuff, just bacteriological warfare, should not be done. It's already out there. But okay, thank you. And yeah, please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy my video. Thank you.